Well, we've had a couple of weeks break since our last session on image design, and I thought we'd just rehash where we were with respect to where we started. And we seem to be almost going down a rabbit hole with all these different ways to think about image design. So I thought I'd just bring us back up again, and you can see where we're at and where we're going to. And so essentially we started off the beginning of the year saying that when we go to take a photograph, we've got ourselves, our camera, and the subject. And most people think that a good photograph comes out of the camera and that all you need to do is press a button. And what we discussed last year was how much we had to think about how we set the camera to get the sort of photograph that we needed. And also that we need to know what we want before we actually set the camera. And we also need to know what we want the image to look like before we actually select the subject and the perspective and the point of view that we're actually going to take that image. And then we talked about what does make an engaging image, and there was three aspects of that. One is timing, and that's where our camera, it's really important that we press that button at exactly the right time to capture exactly the right pose or expression or the movement of the object that we're trying to capture. But we also realized that the aesthetics of an image, in terms of its pleasing the eye, and also the narrative of the image in terms of the emotional tug, were perhaps more important than anything. That the extent of time that the viewer stays engaged with the image is an indication of how good it is. And so trying to understand how do we get narrative into image, and the narrative is not necessarily just a story. It can be about feel and emotive narrative. So sometimes an image can tug at our heartstrings and we actually put the story into it. And so when we were exploring image design, we looked at lots of different ways that we can incorporate different aspects of shape and lines. And today we're actually going to explore texture, and that's under this shape and form part of image design, of looking at how can we optimize the texture in an image to invoke that emotive feel. So that's where we're at, and we're going to explore all of these different buttons over this image design series. And the better the image is, the more of these buttons you've actually pushed when you press the button in the camera. And so by understanding all the aspects that can contribute to the narrative and the aesthetics of an image, if you can manage to put nearly every single one of them in, plus timing, you've got the essence of an amazing image. So when you have got the camera and you've got a great place, then walk around and have a look at what can you do to add all of these other elements in. And it may be just where you stand, it may be where you position the camera, it may be some of the technical choices you use in terms of where you put your focal point or the depth of field that you choose. So today we're going to be talking about image texture and how much that actually contributes to the narrative. And what it does, it enables the viewer to feel your image. Although your image is separate from them and it's 2D, if you can really optimize the texture in an image, not only do they see the image, but they also feel it. And that's what triggers their emotional connection to it. Now, texture can come in lots of different ways. It can be edgy and sharp, as in the image on the left here. And you can see that there is an emotive aspect to this lion as well. He looks like the saddest lion in the world. But the textures in his mane are what makes the image, the textures and the flow and the shape. And so when I took that, I had to really optimize how I captured that and where I stood to get the light to be optimized to bring out all of the texture in the main. The other image is one that you create using intentional camera movement, and it has an emotive aspect to it. Anything that's sort of blurry or vague is dreamy, and so images can give different feels to the viewer based on how they've actually been taken. So when you're actually taking an image and you notice that within the subject area there's a beautiful texture, and that's what caught your attention in the first place, then you need to try and optimize how you use the camera to capture that. And it may be, as in the case of the lion, to make sure that it was actually focused with a strong enough depth of field or a large enough depth of field to get all the textures within that mane. It may be that you need to stand straight on so that that depth of field is across the entire texture in the image, and ensure that you've got a lens that can actually capture the texture. So if you are doing a macro shot, that you've got a macro lens and you've got the depth of field set correctly to ensure that you get the texture that you're trying to photograph. The other thing is think about the shutter speed, making sure that it's fast enough that you get a nice sharp texture, or that it's slow enough if you are using intentional camera movement to get that blurry, dreamy feel. And whenever we're trying to optimize textures, we need to try and utilize the light. And side lighting, light coming on the subject from the side, gives us a much more 3D feel to a texture. So whenever we're trying to capture texture, move around or move the subject around, or ideally arrive at the right time if you're using the sunlight as texture to optimize your texture, to get that side lighting. And also if we've got contrast within that we've got light and shadows, that it isn't quite a flat light, that will also optimize the texture that we get in an image. And so I'm just going to show you some examples of when I've photographed and I've been trying to optimize the texture in the subject, because that is, the subject may not be beautiful, as in the cactus on the left here, but it's the texture, it's the prickles and the edginess that they give, and they make the viewer feel. You just know that if you reached out and touched one of those prickles, it would be sharp. And the one on the right was a beach scene that I took last week in Tasmania, and there wasn't a lot going for that beach scene, but I thought there was the darkness and the lightness of the waves, and it was just the setting sun was putting colours in the sky. So I thought, well, what I'll do is there's no subject here, nothing that the viewer can rest their eye on, but it is a fairly emotive if you try and use some camera movement. So that's what I did there. We can also try and optimize the texture for touch. And so the beautiful moss on this rock, yes, it was a contrasty color, and that's what drew my eye to it in the first place. But I really wanted to get the feel of it, because you just want to reach out and touch it. And the one on the right with these prickly, I don't know what they are, they're seeds of some sort of plant. You can almost feel those when you look at them as well. So that's what you're trying to choose when you're actually selecting your camera settings, is to optimize the texture. And you choose your lens and your depth of field and your shutter speed and your focal point to ensure the viewer knows what you're wanting to have a look at. So we can have different textures. We've looked at prickly and velvety. We can have reflective textures, and the one up the top is a very smooth texture, and the one down the bottom, I took this rock because I just loved its textures, its colors and its textures. This is about timing. This was a spot again in Tasmania last week, and it's got everything. The sun was rising and there's colours in the sky, and It's got the rough textures in the sand and the textures in all the leaves. But I noticed that every now and again, when the water spilled in, it was a lagoon, and when the water spilled in, it created lovely ripples in the waves. But I had to take about 20 shots before I got the one with the ripples, because, you know, every wave is different. So this is where we introduce timing into optimizing your texture as well. And you can see that if that is perfectly smooth, it would have been not a boring photo, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting without that texture. So sometimes it's a matter of waiting to get the texture. And with this one, it was about all the different textures of the rock, the moss, the sand, the reflective sky, the trees in the background. And that's what makes this image. Yes, it has some lovely colors in it and some interesting subject, but it's the variety in textures that just adds that extra dimension to the subject. And the same with this one, where we've got rough and spiky and splashy, and it's all about the textures. Yes, it's got a nice color palette, but it's the textures that make the image. So think about texture when you're shooting. Sometimes we can make textures in our shots. And so all of those were natural textures, organic textures. These are ones that I've actually created. So the one on the left, this was during COVID, fooling around, trying to shoot with inside the house while we're in lockdown. And I got a Perspex sheet and just sprayed some water on a Perspex sheet and put it in front of some flowers that were just sitting on a table. So by doing that, introduce textures into an image. So think about doing some of those things when you're just having a bit of a play at home on a wet Sunday afternoon. The one on the right was, I'd seen some flower photography done by an English photographer, and he'd stretched a stocking over the front of his lens. And that gives a soft, blurry texture to your image. So what I did was take two shots, one without the stocking. I put the camera on a tripod, did one with the stocking, and that way the sharpness that you can see here, I've just blended in from 2 layers in Photoshop, so to give some sharpness to the image, but to allow the rest of it to be blurry. So they're ways that you can invoke emotion into your images by just introducing texture. And you can also introduce texture by camera movement. And we talked about the intentional camera movement with those soft blurry ones before. But again, this was another beach scene I was at last week. It was pretty plain and ordinary. The light was really ordinary. There was, the photos were flat. But I thought there's lots of colors in this ocean. There was the sand, there was the white edge of the wave, there was the darkness in the water because it was quite cloudy and overcast. And so I thought, well, I'll try some intentional camera movement, because whenever you've got good tonal difference between what you're taking, you can usually get a good intentional camera movement shot. And the one on the right, I think, was just some bushes, but I wiggled the camera to introduce the texture. So intentional camera movement is when you take down your shutter speed to 1/4 second or a second, and you have to really make your aperture tiny, so go up to f16, f22, f32 to let very little light in, and the lowest ISO you can get, and just wiggle the camera and have a play. It's very addictive, and you can end up with some amazing stuff. A bit like tie-dyeing, where you don't know what you're going to get until you do it, and then you go, wow, that's amazing. So another way that you can introduce texture into your images is actually in post when you're editing. It's not so much of introducing texture, but really optimizing the texture that you've got there. And so use the sliders in your editing program within Lightroom. They've got texture, clarity, dehaze, sharpness and contrast. And that really optimizes anything that can get the contrast into the spot that you're trying to enhance the texture. Don't do it across the whole image. Try and use masking to try and just optimize the texture within the section that you're wanting to optimize. If you use this on the sky, it often looks too crunchy and makes your image look a bit over processed. But just use a brush in your masking and just highlight the area and increase each one of those sliders and take them up, take them down, see what it does. And there's also plugins like Nik, their color effects detail extractor. Again, don't use it across the whole image, just use a brush and brush it in to the spots to give it texture. You can also introduce texture by using layers in Photoshop and having a texture in one of the layers and your image in the other layer. And these are two images that I thought were rather, they had potential when I didn't use the texture, but I thought that they just needed something else. And so the one on the left here is a bunch of flowers. And when I was in Bali, they had a lovely like marble opalescent floor, which I just took a picture of. And so this has the floor overlaid over this image. And the one on the right is just a lily. I took at Ripon Lee when we were there last time. And it was just a fairly bland lily, and I've just put a texture over the top of it. So the next slide you can see, this was a texture that I photographed when we were in the Science Works in the sewage facility. It was just the wall. And you remember there was some old grotty walls in that building. And I know a number of you gave me a bit of a strange look when I'm just photographing the old grotty walls. But I love grotty walls for adding texture. And so Photoshop gives you the capability to put the texture over the top of your image and then selectively blend it in using a blend mode. And so it gives it a really grungy, crunchy feel and quite an artistic look when you can do that. So think about getting some of those skill sets. I'm happy to do a session for you on how to do these sorts of things, but it allows you to take your images from being just a snapshot like it was on the left into something that's much more artistic. So for your homework this week, I'd like you to think about bringing that element into your photographs if you can when you're at the next time you're shooting or at our next workshop, and try and think about the textures. Now, I understand from Alan we're going to Melbourne University next week, and it has some beautiful textures in its stonework. And the other thing is just take a close-up photo of some of those stones and see if you can try some of those blend modes in Photoshop. Use the different techniques that I've taught today about either using your camera settings and capture optimally the texture in camera, or try and enhance that texture later in your editing software. And when you are out shooting, try and think about all of the different things that we've talked about of lines and shapes and leading lines and textures, point of view, shooting portrait, shooting landscape, all of those things to really ensure that you bring all of these elements to make an amazing image. And until next week, thanks.